My name is Megan Bostick, and this virtual presentation is a synopsis of my thesis work for my Master's of Art and Design degree at North Carolina State University in the southeastern United States. Art as Catalyst for Conversations about Death and Dying. Nicole Collins, a Canadian visual artist, has written, "It's not hard to explain this compulsion to reconstruct, but is my personal history necessarily a part of this? Why include biography? Everyone has a relationship with death. Maybe I have experienced more loss than most. One loss is enough initiation." I do think that one loss is certainly enough to become initiated into grief, and I, like many, am among the initiated. But why exclude biography from the discourse? Are the maker and the made that separable? As initial precedent for my work, I offer my personal history, my story of initiation into the bereaved. My explorations as a visual artist began as an expression of anticipatory grief 8 years ago. From the ages of 18 to 24, I found myself grieving the impending death of my mother, who within that time frame was diagnosed with and died from a terminal illness. In attempts to make sense of the inevitable loss, I poured myself into making. At that point, during my undergraduate studies, my work was primarily an exercise in employing concept. I was utilizing fibrous techniques, surface design and weaving, but with both fibrous materials and alternative materials. The techniques and materials I have utilized since that time remain similar, but materiality and material manipulation have taken precedence over adhering to traditional fibrous methods of working. The concepts I worked with then still remain: grief and its manifestations. However, my work has expanded into an understanding and expression of formal realized grief, grief that occurs after the death. Upon entering graduate school, my mother died, and I began again with myself, visually translating my experiences with grief and loss, moving alternatively between quantitative and qualitative expressions. The first piece I created during my graduate studies, The First Month of Grief, a study, marked the days of grief with hair and resin encased in petri dishes, which were organized into the form of a calendar month, 5 rows of 7. The next piece was the second month of grief, an attempt at clarity. Both pieces were about counting and marking the days that had passed since her death. I began manipulating materials to speak evocatively and abstractly about the experience. This piece deals with the first year of grief and is constructed from silk organza, which I dyed with grocery store products and then cut, burnt, waxed, stitched, and rewaxed. This piece went through many static iterations before the final version, seen here. Next came this piece, Lamentation, in which I wanted to communicate the confusion, the uncertainty, and the surreality of the days preceding my mother's death. I went back to experimenting with alternative materials at this point, using white grocery bags and fusing them together to create a layered plastic fabric. After exploring my personal grief through making, I was compelled to start telling the stories of others. The easiest place for me to begin was with my family. I interviewed the family members who were closest to my mother throughout the illness and surrounding her death. Each individual form seen here represents one family member, and the markings on each were made after I studied the interview answers they gave me. This piece is constructed with stiffened Kleenex, beeswax, and oil pastels. There was a compulsion next to find a sort of community of loss, of those grieving. After my first year in the 3-year graduate program, I was approached by a friend who wanted to tell me her story, one that resonated with mine in that it dealt with motherlessness. Only her experience was incredibly different. And so the biopsies of loss piece began. They are representations of the stories of 3 women, each of whom lost a mother in different ways over different spans of time and who had different types of mothers. This piece attempts to show the chronology and the nature of their experiences. I spent about 2 hours with each woman as they shared their stories and gave me permission to be a witness to what they'd been through. For this series, I sourced materials that were referenced in their stories. This expansion in my work brought me to a place of continual shift, a distension in what I've been pursuing. Grief can serve and has served as concept for the work that I do. Precedent obviously isn't just about personal experience, although that's what grounds most of my work. I've searched for precedent, artists who use grief as concept and artists who use grief as catalyst. The following artists address grief conceptually, visually, and verbally, confronting grief when making, writing, and speaking about their work. Beverly Ailing Smith is a British textile artist and embroiderer working in mixed media. In her own writing, an essay entitled Cloth, Memory, and Mourning, she presents the idea that artists are familiar with the notion of making public that which is normally considered private, and grief and mourning are not exceptions to this endeavor. Her focus on grief stems from what follows death in her culture, burial. Utilizing traditional burial materials of lead and linen, Ailing Smith manipulates the materials, but not beyond recognition. Nicole Collins is a Canadian visual artist primarily utilizing the mediums of wax and pigment. Her concept pushes through the surface of her paintings in revealed metaphors, and her titles give viewer entrances into her pieces. On her website, she refers to her creating process as an instinctual one that involves a continual construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction of the work. In her thesis writing, she muses, "My goal as an artist right now, in this moment, is to synthesize the mystery of the intuitive with the distilled clarity of the rational." That balance that she describes is the balance I am constantly seeking. Anniken Amundsen is a Norwegian textile artist who channeled her diagnosis and battle with cancer into art making, creating a comprehensive exhibit, Invaders. As Oliver Lowenstein said in writing about the exhibit, Amundsen, through this work, was trying to attack the attacker by making cancer, a feared word and concept but physically invisible to our naked eyes, something that was visible. Janru Wan, a Taiwanese-American fiber installation artist, is concerned about viewer interaction with her work. In an exhibition entitled Mending Anticipation, Leah Newman wrote of Janru's pieces and how her art aims to provide viewers with a place to think about, reflect on, discuss, and meditate the emotional response the work might bring up. From Wan's work, I get an understanding of the pervasiveness of grief cross-culturally and the implications of speaking candidly about art. Wan speaks about the emotional impacts for both the maker and the viewer in the same discussions as the process, materials, and techniques. Grief can also serve as catalyst to make human-to-human connections as part of the healing process, catalyst to create pieces that engage the public with difficult topics, catalyst to give voice and visualization to emotions and stories that might otherwise not be heard, seen, or felt. To understand how grief can work as catalyst, I saw artists who have initiated collaborative projects for those who are grieving, being grieved, or are facing anticipatory grief. Textile artist Esther Calaba and writer Karen Hafey, both Canadian, collaborated on a community-based multimedia art project, Collecting Loss. On display for the first time this past November in Toronto, the exhibition was the effort of the artist, writer, and the 100 strangers who contributed articles of clothing representative of their losses as well as their stories. The exhibition incorporated visual, verbal, and digital elements in order to communicate grief. A fiber installation, audio clips, a photo slideshow, and poetry. The installation consisted of 10 distinct pieces, 9 garments, and 1 small stuffed animal, constructed from selected fragments of the donated clothing. Deidre Shear is an American fiber artist whose portraiture in Fabric and Thread is an affecting depiction of the essence of being at the end of life. Shearer produced 2 exhibits based upon interactions with hospice patients and families, the last year, and surrounded by family and friends. As Shearer wrote, "Our society is inept at discussing death. Death occurs just as any other part of life does, sometimes naturally, sometimes traumatically, sometimes expected, sometimes unexpected. Death is unavoidable, yet at times we try to pretend it's not. For the purposes of my research paper and final thesis piece, I partnered with a local hospice organization in the Southeast U.S. So when discussing the culture of death, I'm referring to the prevalent United States experience. Both the past and current culture of death in the United States has been described as one that denies and fears death. But death is natural. Death is the final process of life, a product of living. Death is difficult. There is a trickle down from the healthcare industry in regards to the way we deal with death as a society. Over the course of the last few decades, we have attempted to quarantine death and confine its occurrence to hospitals and nursing homes. Death has been restricted to occur in solitude instead of within the community, and our discomfort with death has only increased as a result. I have yet to come across a more concise and poignant explanation of death than in the following. Death is a process, sometimes protracted and often painful to experience, witness, and accept. To confront death in others would mean to confront death for ourselves, and knowing the dying would elicit a response from us, the living. Their pain would resonate. Death is important. In standard medical care, treatment is aimed at postponing death and therefore prolonging life, without regard for quality of life. In hospice care, treatment is aimed at acknowledging death and maintaining quality of life. Hospice as a philosophy has attempted to bring death back into the conversation about life. Hospice as a practice has begun to bring death out of the hospitals and back into the home. Hospice is about patient-oriented care, focusing on reducing or eliminating pain and discomfort, physical, mental, emotional, psychosocial pain. Death is certainly an unknown, but dying could be more familiar if we allowed it. Perhaps death could be met with less confusion and less fear if we understood what it meant to confront dying. I do think that death will always resist belief. It is in our human nature to find that magnitude of personal loss beyond comprehension. Regardless, death persists. With regards to the dying, those facing terminal diagnoses, we must recognize their personhood, their right to say goodbye when they are ready. We must allow people to die. We must say to them and tell them it's all right to die. We must let go. If our collective consciousness is shifted enough, perhaps we will start using dying as a learning experience, a way of understanding how to prepare for our own turn to face death. One method of acknowledging the wounds of death and beginning to shift awareness is through investigation, probing our way into the pain. Art can offer assistance here, as art is meant to investigate, to reveal what our society resists acknowledging. The arts have the ability to transform and deepen how we perceive and understand death and dying. I am firmly rooted in the understanding that art is an expression made visible by a form. The expression contained in the form is an attempt to translate the unnamed and the unknown. Intrinsic to our existence as humans is our quest to create meaning, and art allows that process to take place. Art at its root is an expression, and the artist is an expressor, translating in order to create meaning. Art expresses and translates, art acknowledges and reveals, art transfers, and art intervenes. Art can and should name the unknown and the unnamed. Art is the most valuable tool I have for facilitating change on any scale, no matter how small. And I thought that the legacies, the stories of hospice patients, would be a compelling medium with which to forge that change. Which brings us to the next phase of expanding my own work, gathering the stories of the community and shifting my concept from the grieving process to the dying process, from stories of the living to stories of the dying. My initial plan for this final piece of my thesis work involved recording the stories of hospice patients at the local hospice I partnered with. I knew what my process had been, and I knew what my process would be. I would feel an emotional response to a lived experience. Based on that experience, I would immerse myself in research in and around the emotions and experience. Then I would gather the stories At that point, I would begin to understand more clearly and begin to articulate what the piece could be, should be, might be, which would lead me to actually create the piece. I'd already felt the emotion. I'd been volunteering with hospice for a year before this project came into being, and I had an understanding of the sadness, grief, awareness, and compulsion inherent in those experiences. I had immersed myself in the research. I had an understanding of the desire for terminally ill patients to share a legacy. I had contacted hospice providers around the United States, finding precedent for their legacy projects. I had spent half a year meeting with the volunteer coordinator and the vice president of clinical operations at my local hospice facility, sharing the results of my research and determining our next steps together. That aspect of the project continues even now, almost a year from its initiation, slowly but steadily. But as a first step in this expansion towards community, I began thinking about the patients I had already spent time with, those stories I had already gathered. As a family support volunteer with hospice, I had already had the opportunity to spend time with 4 women at the end of their lives. The youngest was 81. I was able to visit her twice before she died. The oldest was 95, and I was fortunate enough to visit her once a week for almost a year. Each of these women had a similar aspect of their diagnoses, dementia. It was their secondary diagnosis, secondary to cancer or to debility. The overwhelming similarity of the experiences I've had with those women was the gradual loss of themselves they experienced. Loss of independence, autonomy, memory, body function, awareness, cognition. And those losses were related to the debility, yes, but the dementia made the more profound impact. I went back and looked at what I had written and discussed about my thesis project up until that point. I consulted my project goal again. What did I actually want to achieve? The project will bring awareness to the local community about hospice, as well as contribute to the culture of death awareness and acceptance. In my thesis project statement, I had written, I will create an installation of my own work, my personal response to interacting with hospice patients and their stories, utilizing textile techniques and alternative materials. Things started coming together and I was beginning to understand. I wanted the piece to be accessible and not too cerebral, and to be poignant, emotional, and provoking. I wanted viewers to get a sense of the vulnerability and desperation that occurs with a diagnosis of dementia. I wanted viewers to feel uncomfortable, maybe a little trapped, and perhaps question why they are feeling that way. So I began to create. I knew my materials needed to vary between translucent, transparent, and opaque to abstract the cloudiness and bleakness and progression of dementia. I decided to order 2,000 hospital identification bracelets, as those are used in hospitals as well as nursing homes where most of my patients resided. If dementia was about loss of memory and loss of self, what would I use as identifiers on the bracelets? My first thought was names. Our names are our identifiers, but I was concerned that a specific name or many specific names might not resonate with as many viewers. So I came to the phrase I am and its inverse, am I, stitched on each bracelet without any thread, puncturing the plastic with the sewing machine needle. And I considered what experience I wanted the viewer to have in the space, walking through, surrounded on either side, becoming increasingly uncomfortable and uncertain. My work with hospice continues, and the conversations I've had because of these pieces have increased my sense of personal community. Everyone has experienced or will experience grief and loss in some capacity, and I will continue to make art that strives to spark sincere conversations about these difficult topics. Thank you for listening. I do appreciate it. Here are a list of works cited that I referenced throughout the presentation. And finally, for more information, please feel free to visit my website. The thesis document in its entirety is there.